a quiet New Jersey suburb where neat little houses with white picket fences lined up in neat rows like soldiers on parade was exactly the kind of place people call the American dream. Maplewood Street, surrounded by green maples and oaks, smelled of freshly mown grass and morning dew. Here, in a house with blue shutters and a manicured lawn, lived Michael and Sarah Davis with their two children, 10-year-old Oliver and 7-year-old Emma. Their life, at first glance, was the perfect picture from a magazine. Family dinners around the table, school plays, Saturday trips to the lake. But behind this facade, like behind a thin screen, hid shadows that no one noticed. For now. Michael woke at 6:30 and to the sound of his alarm clock, which he hated with all his heart. Its harsh, electronic beep was a reminder that another day was scheduled down to the minute. He stretched, feeling his muscles ache from the previous day's run. At 38, he still tried to stay in shape, although running no longer brought him the joy it once did. Sarah was asleep next to him, her face curled up in the pillow. Her blonde hair was spread out over the white pillowcase, and in the morning light filtering through the blinds, she looked almost as young as she had on their wedding day. Almost. Michael stood up quietly, trying not to wake her, and went to the bathroom. The cold water splashing on his face brought him back to his senses a little. He looked in the mirror, dark circles under his eyes, the first hints of gray in his dark hair. I should shave, he thought, but then decided that stubble would be considered stylish. After all, he was an engineer, not a model. The kitchen was already alive when he came downstairs. Oliver was sitting at the table, his nose buried in a bowl of cereal, scrolling through something on his tablet. Emma, in her unicorn pajamas, was spreading jam on toast, humming a song Michael didn't recognize. "Good morning, team," he said, trying to sound cheerful. "What's on the agenda today?" Oliver looked up from the screen, his brown eyes, inherited from Sarah, flashing with slight irritation. "Dad, did you forget again? I have football after school today, and Emma is dancing. Mom reminded me all evening yesterday." Michael cursed silently. Of course, he had forgotten. He had been up late last night drawing up plans for a new project, a bridge across the Hudson River that his company was supposed to have completed by next year. He nodded, hiding his awkwardness. Exactly. Football and dancing. I remember everything." Emma giggled, her freckles dancing across her cheeks. "Dad, you always say that, and then Mom gets angry." "Well, I'll be on top of things today," Michael winked, pouring himself some coffee. "Where's Mom, by the way?" "Upstairs," Oliver muttered, not looking up from his tablet. "Said she needed 5 minutes to gather her thoughts." Michael smiled, but his chest hurt. Sarah had been collecting her thoughts a lot lately. He couldn't say exactly when it had started a couple of months ago, maybe. She had become quieter, more thoughtful, and stayed late at work more often. He chalked it up to stress. Her new position at a marketing agency required more time and energy than before. But something about her silence still bothered him. Sarah came down 10 minutes later, dressed in a formal pantsuit, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. She looked like someone who always knew what she was doing. But Michael, who had known her for almost 15 years, noticed a slight weariness in her movements, as if each step required a little more effort than before. "Good morning," she said, kissing Emma on the top of her head and glancing quickly at Michael. "Do you remember the kids' schedule?" "Football and dancing," Michael said crisply, raising his coffee mug as if taking an exam. Sarah smiled slightly, but her eyes remained serious. "Great. I'll be late today. We have a presentation for a client. Can you pick Emma up from the dance at 6? "No problem," Michael nodded, although in his head he was already figuring out how to find time between the meeting with the contractors and the deadline for the drawings. Sarah took the toast, took a bite, and looked at Oliver. "Ollie, put the tablet away. Breakfast is family time, not video game time." Oliver rolled his eyes, but obediently put the gadget down. Michael found himself thinking that Sarah sounded more like a strict teacher than a mother. When had she become so? Distant. "Mom, will you come to my play next week?" Emma asked, looking at Sarah with big blue eyes. Of course, dear, Sarah replied, but her voice wavered, and she quickly turned away to pour herself some coffee. I'll try. Michael frowned. I'll try was not what Emma wanted to hear. He decided to change the subject. Hey, what kind of show is this? Are you playing a princess or maybe a dragon? Emma giggled. Dad, I'm playing with a tree, but I have a whole line. SHHH, it's the wind in my leaves. Wow, that's a serious part, Michael said, his eyes widening dramatically. I'll have to learn your line so I can applaud louder than anyone else. Emma beamed, and Sarah seemed to relax a little. She looked at Michael gratefully, but something in her gaze made him feel uneasy, as if she was thanking him for doing her job of being a parent. The day passed in the usual rhythm. Michael took the children to school, then drove to the office of his engineering firm in the city center. Work was his refuge. Drawings, calculations, logic, all of it was understandable and predictable, unlike human emotions. He loved his profession, although sometimes it sucked all the energy out of him. Today, he had a meeting with contractors who were again trying to cut the budget for materials for the bridge. Michael knew it was a bad idea, but convincing them was like banging his head against a brick wall. Michael, you understand, said Ted, the manager with a red face and perpetually sweaty palms. We can save a couple of million if we choose cheaper steel. Ted, Michael tried to speak calmly, although inside he was seething. Cheap steel is a risk. Do you want the bridge to collapse in 5 years, or for us all to be fired for negligence? Ted rolled his eyes, but didn't argue. Michael knew this conversation wasn't over, but at least he had won for today. Meanwhile, Sarah sat in her office, staring at her laptop screen. Her presentation to the client was almost done, but her mind was elsewhere. She opened her instant messenger and reread the message she had received last night. Sarah, we need to talk. It's important. The sender was her colleague Jason, with whom she had worked on a recent project. She didn't respond. Not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know what to say. Jason was complicated, charming, witty, but with him she felt like she was walking on thin ice. And yet, his messages made her heart beat a little faster. She closed her laptop and looked out the window. The city was noisy beyond the glass, and she felt cut off from it all. She had once loved her job, loved creating campaigns, coming up with ideas. But now it all seemed routine. Or maybe it wasn't the job, but her. That evening, Michael picked Emma up from the dance as promised. She ran out of the studio, her pigtails bouncing and her eyes shining. Dad, I learned to do a pirouette. Do you want to see? Right here, Michael glanced around the parking lot, where several parents were waiting for their children. Come on, Star, show off your skills. Emma spun around, her pink skirt flying, and Michael clapped his hands, even though she nearly crashed into a trash can. He laughed, scooped her up, and spun her around. You will be the best tree in the world, he said, placing her on the ground. When they got home, Oliver was already doing his homework, and Sarah was cooking dinner. The smell of fried chicken and garlic bread filled the kitchen, and for a moment, everything seemed like it had been before. The family gathered around the table, and Michael felt a warmth he had rarely felt in a long time. How was your day? He asked, looking at Sarah. She shrugged, not looking up from her plate. Usually. The presentation went well, the client was happy. And you? The contractors are trying to save on everything again, Michael sighed. But I got the better of them. For now. Sarah nodded, but her mind seemed to be elsewhere. Oliver and Emma were chatting about school, about how one of Oliver's classmates had eaten chalk on a dare, and Michael was laughing, but his eyes kept returning to Sarah. She smiled when the children joked, but it was forced, like she was acting. After dinner, when the children went to watch cartoons, Michael approached Sarah, who was washing the dishes. Is everything okay? He asked quietly, leaning on the tabletop. She froze, her hands in soapy foam hovering over the plate. Yes, everything is fine, she answered without looking at him. I'm just tired. Sarah, he put his hand on her shoulder, if something's wrong, you'll tell me, right? She turned, her eyes meeting his, and for a second he thought she was going to cry. But she only nodded. Of course. It's okay, Michael. Really. He wanted to believe her. He really wanted to. But something in her voice, in her eyes, told him that this was only the beginning of something that could destroy their perfect facade. Saturday morning at the Davis house began leisurely, as befits a weekend in the suburbs. The sun slid lazily through the curtains, painting golden streaks across the wooden floor of the living room. Michael sat on the couch with a cup of cold coffee, scrolling through work emails on his laptop. He tried to concentrate on the report on the load on the bridge piers, but his mind kept slipping back to the night before. Sarah was distant again, her answers to questions sounding mechanical, like memorized lines. He brushed the thoughts aside, chalking them up to fatigue, but a vague unease was brewing in his chest. Emma burst into the living room, her bare feet slapping the floor, clutching an iPad that looked almost like an extension of her small hands. Her face was a mixture of irritation and hope. "Dad, the Wi-Fi's down again," she said, holding out the tablet. "I wanted to watch a video about puppies, but it won't load." Michael put down his laptop and picked up his iPad, smiling at her serious tone. Emma was always like that. If something didn't go according to plan, it became a personal tragedy. "Puppies, huh?" He winked, opening the settings. "Let's figure out what kind of rebellion our router has started." He checked the connection, rebooted the network, but the iPad stubbornly refused to pick up a signal. Michael frowned, trying to remember when the router had last been updated. Emma hovered impatiently nearby, peering over his shoulder. "So, Dad, is it working already?" "Give me another minute, champ," he said, fiddling with the settings. Sometimes technology likes to play hide and seek. While he was fiddling with the Wi-Fi, a notification from the messaging app popped up on his screen. Michael tapped it reflexively, thinking it might be spam or a reminder for a school event. Instead, a conversation opened, and his eye caught the name at the top of the screen, Jason. Not Jason from tech support or Jason, Oliver's coach, just Jason. And the messages he saw made him freeze. "Sarah, yesterday was great. When will we see each other again?" Michael blinked as if trying to shake off the spell. His fingers hovered over the screen, questions swirling in his head. He scrolled up, hoping it was just a misunderstanding, some work chat he'd misunderstood. But the next messages only deepened the chill that was beginning to spread through his chest. "You were amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. Sarah, I know this is hard, but we need to talk. I don't want to push, but I feel something real for you." Michael felt the blood rush to his temples. His hands began to shake, and he quickly closed the app, as if it might erase what he had just read. Emma was still standing there, chattering about puppies, but her voice was in the background, like the noise of a distant radio. "Dad, Dad, can you hear me?" Emma tugged at his sleeve. "Huh? Yeah, everything's fine," he squeezed out, handing her the iPad back. "I think the Wi-Fi is working. Try again." Emma happily grabbed the tablet and ran to her room, leaving Michael sitting there, staring into space. His mind was racing between disbelief and rage. Sarah? Hi, Sarah. With someone else? It was beyond him. They had been together for 15 years, through everything from frat parties to mortgages to sleepless nights with babies. She couldn't. Not Sarah. He stood up and paced the living room, trying to calm himself. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe Jason was just a coworker who got too carried away, and Sarah just hadn't responded. He wanted to believe it, but the messages were too personal, too intimate. And her responses. He didn't read them all the way through, but their very existence burned him inside. Sarah was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for a salad. Her movements were precise, almost automatic, but there was the same thoughtfulness in her eyes that Michael had noticed more and more often. She hadn't heard him enter until he cleared his throat to get her attention. "Oh, there you are," she said, startled slightly. "I thought you were working." "Emma asked me to fix the Wi-Fi," he said, trying to keep his voice even, on her iPad. Sarah nodded, going back to slicing the cucumbers. "She's always looking at something on that tablet." We should limit her screen time. Michael looked at her, trying to find in her face some hint of what he had seen in those messages. But she looked as usual calm, collected, a little tired. He opened his mouth to ask, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he said, "Sarah, are you? Everything okay? With you? With work?" She froze for a second, the knife in her hand hovering over the cutting board. Then she smiled, but the smile was too quick, too forced. "Yes, everything is fine. Just a lot of things to do. You know how it is." Michael nodded, though his insides were clenching. He wanted to scream, to ask who Jason was, what she was hiding, but instead he just said, "If something was wrong, you would tell me, right?" "Of course," she answered without looking at him. "It's okay, Michael." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, feeling the walls of the house they were building together begin to close in on him. He couldn't sit still any longer. Grabbing his keys, he shouted that he was going to the store, when really he just needed to get out, get some air, think. It was warm outside, but Michael felt a chill. He got into his car and just sat there, looking at the house next door where old Paul was mowing the lawn. Everything looked so normal, so right, but something important was crumbling inside him. He pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app to jot down his thoughts, but instead he started scrolling through photos. There was him and Sarah at graduation, laughing, young, carefree. There was their wedding, she in a white dress, he in an unfamiliar suit, both beaming with happiness. There was Oliver, a newborn, a tiny bundle in her arms. And Emma, running on the beach last summer, sand in her hair. He closed his eyes, trying to remember when it all changed. When Sarah stopped laughing at his stupid jokes. When he stopped noticing her. Work, kids, bills, it had all swallowed them up like a whirlpool. But betrayal, it was too much. It was a betrayal of everything they had built. When he got home, he found Sarah on the couch reading a book. She looked up, and for a second he thought she was about to say something. Instead, she simply asked, "Did you buy anything?" "I forgot," he muttered as he passed by. "My head is full." She didn't answer, and that silence was louder than any words. "Now tell us where you watch us from, and maybe you or your friends have similar interesting stories." The rest of the day passed in a strange tension. Michael helped Oliver with his math homework, trying to focus on fractions, but his mind kept returning to those text messages. He imagined Jason, some sleek marketer with a fancy jacket, a charming smile, and an ease that Michael never had. He hated himself for thinking about it, but he couldn't stop it. By evening, when the children had gone to bed, Michael decided he couldn't keep quiet any longer. He went down to the living room where Sarah was sitting with a glass of wine, scrolling through her phone. He sat down across from her, feeling her heart pounding in his chest. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. She looked up, and something flickered in her gaze fear. Guilt? He couldn't tell. "About what?" she asked, putting the phone down. "I saw the messages. On Emma's iPad. From someone named Jason." Her face turned pale, but she quickly pulled herself together. "Have you been going through my messages?" Her voice was sharp, almost accusing. "I wasn't digging," Michael snapped. "I was trying to fix the Wi-Fi, and they popped up. Who is Jason, Sarah? And why is he texting you?" Things like that. She was silent, looking at the floor. Her fingers nervously fiddled with the edge of the pillow. "It's not what you think," she finally said, but her voice was quiet, uncertain. "Then explain what it is," Michael said, feeling his insides boil. "Because I read that he can't stop thinking about you. Is that normal for a coworker?" Sarah sighed, her shoulders slumping as if she was carrying a heavy load. "Jason is my colleague. We work on the same project. He's just too emotional. It doesn't mean anything." Michael looked at her, trying to believe, but her words sounded like an excuse, like something she forced herself to believe. "Sarah," he said, his voice shaking, "are you cheating on me?" She raised her head sharply, her eyes flashing. "How can you ask such a thing? After everything we've been through, I would never." "Then why won't you look me in the eye?" he interrupted. "Why are you so distant? I'm not blind, Sarah. I can see that something is wrong." She opened her mouth to respond, but instead simply shook her head and stood up. "I don't want to discuss it. Not now." She went upstairs, leaving him alone in the living room. Michael sat there, staring at the empty glass of wine she had left on the table. He felt as if the world he knew was beginning to crumble, and the worst part was he didn't know how to stop it. Michael hadn't slept for 3 nights in a row. The darkness of his bedroom, pierced by the dim light from the street lamps, was too thick, almost tangible. He lay staring at the ceiling, listening to Sarah's even breathing as she slept next to him. Her calm, her serenity in her sleep irritated him, as if she were mocking him without even realizing it. The messages from Jason that he had seen on Emma's iPad burned him like hot coals. He hadn't said a word to her about what he knew. It wasn't because he didn't want to. He simply couldn't. The words stuck in his throat like jagged splinters, and he was afraid that if he spoke, everything would fall apart. Their family, their home, their life, everything they had spent 15 years building. So he remained silent and watched. Sunday morning at the Davis house began with the usual weekend chaos. Oliver, sleepy and disheveled, sat at the kitchen table, idly picking at the oatmeal that Sarah had insisted on making instead of his favorite sugary cereal. Emma, on the other hand, was full of energy. She was doodling on a piece of paper, humming a song about unicorns, and occasionally kicking a chair with her leg, causing it to creak slightly. Michael sat opposite, clutching a mug of coffee that had already cooled. He looked at Sarah, standing at the stove, and tried to find something in her movements that would give her away. But she was as usual, focused, slightly tired, with her blonde hair pulled back neatly into a bun. She flipped a pancake in the frying pan, and her movements were so smooth, so familiar, that Michael almost believed that everything was okay. Almost. "Dad, you're in the air again," Emma said, looking up from her drawing. Her blue eyes, just like Sarah's, looked at him curiously. "You promised to watch my new dance steps." Michael forced himself to smile, though it was strained, as if he was wearing someone else's mask. "Of course, honey. After breakfast, we'll make a scene for you right in the living room." Emma beamed, and Sarah glanced at him briefly, warm but with a slight shadow that he was now noticing more and more often. Or was it just his imagination? He didn't know. But every move, every glance now seemed to him part of some complex game in which he didn't know the rules. "Oliver, stop looking at your phone," Sarah said, placing a plate of pancakes in front of him. "Breakfast is family time." Oliver rolled his eyes, but obediently put his phone down. Michael noticed the way Sarah's eyes lingered on the screen for a moment before looking away. It was a fleeting moment, but it pricked him like a needle. Was she checking her messages, or was it just a reflex? He hated himself for analyzing her every move now, but he couldn't stop. "You seem a little lively today," he said, trying to sound casual. "Good news at work?" Sarah shrugged, not looking up from the frying pan. "Just got some sleep," she said, and her tone was so light that Michael almost believed it. "What about you? You look like the bridge over the Hudson fell down." He forced out a laugh, even though his insides clenched. "It's still worth it. But contractors are still trying to cut the budget. Nothing new." She nodded, and the conversation died down. Michael looked at her, trying to catch any hint of a lie, but her face was unreadable. He hated this feeling, like he was spying on his own wife. But the texts from Jason, their intimate tone, her evasiveness that night when he asked about them, it all bothered him. He had to know more. That afternoon, while Sarah was busy in the laundry room, Michael decided to check her schedule. He felt mean, invading her privacy, but curiosity, or, more likely, fear was stronger. He pulled up the family calendar on his phone, where they kept track of school events, practices, and work meetings. Sarah's schedule was filled with neat entries, as always. Client meeting on Monday night, campaign discussion on Wednesday, working lunch on Friday. But now he noticed oddities. Some of the meetings were too late for normal work activities, like the team meeting at 8 p.m. last Thursday, or the project deadline on Saturday morning, when she said she was heading into the office to pick up some paperwork. He frowned, scrolling back through the calendar. There were more like that than he'd expected. He closed the app and stared at the ceiling. Was he just being paranoid? Was this really work, and he was seeing things that weren't there? But the messages from Jason were real. "Sarah, yesterday was great. When will I see you again?" The words echoed in his head like a tinkling tune. He couldn't just brush them off. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, Michael sat in the living room, pretending to read a tech magazine. Sarah sat at the other end of the couch, scrolling through her phone. He watched her furtively, the way her fingers flicked across the screen, the way she smiled slightly as she read. His heart sank. This wasn't the way she looked at texts from her friends or coworkers. This was something personal. "You're off early today," he said, trying to sound casual. "No late meetings?" Sarah looked up, her gaze wavering for a second, but she quickly smiled. "Yes, I managed to finish early today. I decided to give myself a break." Michael nodded, but inside he was seething. A break, or simply no meeting with Jason. He hated himself for these thoughts, but they crept into his head like uninvited guests. By Wednesday, his suspicions had become obsessive. He began to notice little things he'd previously ignored. The new perfume Sarah had started wearing, light and jasmine Y, not at all like her usual floral scent. The new earrings she'd worn on Monday, small but clearly expensive. Her habit of checking her phone when she thought he wasn't looking. He began jotting down these details in notes on his phone, as if he were collecting evidence for a trial. Monday, 7:45 p.m., I took the phone to the bathroom. Came back 10 minutes later. Tuesday, 6:30 and replied to text, quickly put phone away when I walked in. It was ridiculous, but he couldn't stop. On Thursday, Sarah announced that she would be late at work for an important client meeting. Michael nodded as usual, but inside he was seething. He waited until she left, called a sitter for Emma and Oliver, saying he needed to go to the office to pick up some blueprints. Instead, he drove to her place of work. Sarah's office was in the center of town, a modern building with large windows that reflected the evening lights. He parked across the street, in the shadows so he wouldn't be seen, and waited. At 7:20 he saw her. Sarah was walking out of the building, her blonde hair loose and her coat fluttering slightly in the wind. She looked alive, as if she had lifted some weight off her shoulders. But she was not alone. There was a man walking next to her, tall, in a dark jacket, with a light beard and a confident smile. They stopped at the entrance, and Michael tensed, peering. The man said something, and Sarah laughed, a light, sincere laugh that Michael had not heard in a long time. They walked across the street to the cafe, and Michael felt his heart clench. He watched them sit by the window, Sarah leaning closer to the man, her hand accidentally brushing his, her smile looking into his eyes. Michael gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wanted to storm into the cafe, make a scene, and demand an explanation. But instead, he just watched his wife sitting with another man and felt his world crumble. It was Jason. He didn't know what this man looked like, but he knew it was him. The one texting her. The one who made her different. He returned home in a daze. The nanny had left, Emma was asleep, and Oliver was playing in his room. Michael sat in the kitchen, staring at the empty table. He felt betrayed, but he also blamed himself. What had he missed? When had he stopped being who he used to be to her? He thought back to their early years, walking through the city at night, holding hands, arguing about what movie to watch, making plans for children and a house. Where had it all gone? That night, he lay awake again. He lay there, staring into the darkness, trying to figure out what to do. Should he tell her? Ask her outright? But what if she lied, or worse, told him the truth? He wasn't ready to hear that. He wasn't ready to ruin everything they had. Oliver and Emma, how would he explain to them if their family fell apart? He imagined their confused faces, their questions he wouldn't have answers to. No, he couldn't talk. Not yet. The next day, he was in a fog. At work, he could barely concentrate, the blueprints blurred before his eyes, and the voices of his coworkers sounded like distant noise. He excused himself and left early, saying he wasn't feeling well. At home, he checked her phone again while she was in the shower. A new text from Jason. Sarah, yesterday was a dream. When are you free next week? Michael felt his throat tighten. He put the phone back and went into the garage, where he kept a workshop. There, surrounded by tools and the smell of wood, he began to plan a board, although he didn't know why. The movement, the sound, the physical work, it was the only thing that helped drown out the chaos in his head. A week passed, and Michael was a shadow of his former self. He had lost weight, there were dark circles under his eyes, and the smile Emma loved so much was a rarity. He continued to watch Sarah, putting the pieces of her life together like a puzzle that refused to fit. Her late arrivals, her excuses, her phone, which she now kept with her at all times. He noticed how she began dressing up more often, not just for work, but with a special kind of care. The new dress she wore on Friday was too elegant for the office. Her lipstick was a little brighter than usual. Even the way she walked seemed different, lighter, more confident. On Saturday, he followed her again. She said she was going to a company brunch, but Michael didn't believe a word she said. He left the kids with a neighbor, said he needed to stop at the hardware store, and followed her. She parked outside a restaurant downtown, a trendy place with big windows and a patio that served mimosas and avocado toast. Michael stopped on the next street, watching. A few minutes later, he saw her walk in, and then the same man, Jason, joined her. They sat on the patio, and Michael watched them laugh, watched him lean toward her, watched her touch his arm. It was like a punch in the gut. He couldn't look away, even though every second was tearing him apart. He returned home feeling empty. Sarah returned a couple of hours later, cheerful, with a slight blush on her cheeks. She kissed him on the cheek as if nothing had happened, and began to tell him about the brunch, about how pleased the client had been with their new campaign. Michael listened, nodding, but every word she said rang out like a lie. He wanted to shout, to ask who Jason was, why she was with him, but instead he remained silent. His silence was his armor and his cage. As the weeks went by, Michael sank deeper into his obsession. He checked her phone while she was sleeping, scrolled through her emails, scanned her calendar for suspicious new entries. He even installed an app that tracked her location, citing the need to make sure she was safe. But every time he saw her downtown, in a cafe or restaurant, his heart sank. He knew she was with him, with Jason. His sleepless nights became the norm. He would lie staring at the ceiling and imagine them together. How she would laugh at his jokes, how she would look at him the way she used to look at Michael. He hated himself for thinking about them, but they were stronger than him. He started drinking more coffee to keep himself going, but it didn't help. His colleagues noticed that he was becoming absent-minded, that his calculations sometimes contained errors that never happened before. Even Oliver once asked, "Dad, why are you so sad? Did you and Mom fight?" Michael forced a smile and said it was okay, but Oliver looked at him doubtfully. The kids sensed something was wrong, even if they couldn't name it. One evening, when Sarah was late again, Michael was sitting in the living room, looking at the family photos on the mantelpiece. Oliver on the football pitch, Emma dressed as a tree, he and Sarah on the beach, hugging, happy. These pictures were like fragments of another life, in which he had been sure of her of them. Now it all seemed like a web of lies in which he was caught. He knew she was cheating. He had seen it with his own eyes. But he still couldn't tell her. Not because he was afraid of her answer, but because he was afraid the truth would destroy everything they had left. He stood up, went to the window, and looked out. The neighbor boy was riding his bike, and old Paul was watering the lawn. Everything looked so normal, so right. But inside, Michael was in turmoil. He didn't know how long he could stay silent. He didn't know how long he could pretend everything was okay. But for now, he held on, clinging to the remnants of their perfect facade like a life preserver. Autumn light streamed through the windows of the Davis house, painting the living room soft shades of ochre and gold. October in New Jersey was rich in color. The maple trees along Maplewood Street were ablaze with crimson, and the air smelled of rotting leaves and smoke from neighbors' fireplaces. Inside, life went on as usual, as if nothing had changed. Oliver and Emma, unaware of the cracks that were spreading through their family's foundation, filled the house with laughter and noise. To them, everything was the same. Mom cooking dinner, Dad fixing bikes in the garage, and Saturdays smelling of pancakes and freshly brewed coffee. But to Michael, every moment was like a knife, stabbing deeper. Saturday morning began with the usual chaos. Emma, in her pink star pajamas, had her sketchbooks and crayons laid out on the kitchen table, busily drawing what she called her masterpiece. Oliver, at the other end of the table, was leafing through a comic book, occasionally glancing at the TV, where a cartoon was playing. Michael sat with a mug of coffee, pretending to read the news on his phone, but his eyes kept drifting back to his children. Their carefreeness, their happiness, tore at his heart. They didn't know anything, and he couldn't decide what was worse, their ignorance or his own inability to protect them from the truth. Dad, look. Emma held up a piece of paper with a drawing of four figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. That's us. You, Mom, me, and Ollie. And this is our house, see, with the blue shutters. Michael forced himself to smile, even though his insides were clenching. They looked so happy in the drawing. Him with his big smile, Sarah with her long blonde hair, Oliver with the football, Emma with her pigtails. This was their family, or rather, the family they had once been. He picked up the drawing, trying not to show the trembling in his hands. "This is simply amazing, honey," he said, patting her head. "You are a real artist." Emma beamed, and Oliver looked up from his comic and snorted. "Dad, you always say that." She drew me with a huge head. "That's because you have big brains," Emma retorted, sticking out her tongue. Michael laughed, but it was hollow, like an echo in an empty room. He looked at the drawing, at the four figures, and felt the pain in his chest become almost unbearable. How could he have let this happen? How could he not have noticed that Sarah was slipping away from him, from them? He wanted to protect the children, to preserve their small, fragile world, but every day spent in silence made it harder. Sarah walked into the kitchen, carrying a basket of laundry. Her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and there was a small smile on her face, the smile Michael had once loved more than anything in the world. Now it seemed like a mask, hiding a lie. She set the basket down and looked at Emma's drawing. "Oh, how beautiful," she said, leaning toward her daughter. "It's us, right?"
Yeah.
Emma jumped up in her chair. "Mom, will you read me a story today? Please, the one about the princess and the dragon." Sarah laughed, and her laugh was so genuine that Michael doubted his suspicions for a second. Maybe he was wrong, maybe it was all in his head. But then he remembered her with Jason in the cafe, her hand on his arm, her smile that wasn't for him. And the doubts evaporated, leaving only a bitter aftertaste. "Of course, dear," Sarah said, kissing Emma on the top of her head. "We'll read tonight, I promise." Michael looked at her, his heart torn between love and rage. She was such a good mother, so caring. How could she be the same woman who lied to him, who dated someone else? He looked away so she wouldn't see his pain and took a sip of cold coffee. That afternoon, while Sarah was out pruning roses and the children were playing in the yard, Michael went into his study, a small room on the second floor where he kept his blueprints and engineering books. He closed the door, took an old notebook out of a drawer, and began to write. It was an impulse, almost an instinct. He felt he had to record everything that was happening, or he would go crazy. His thoughts, his observations, his pain, all of it needed to be released, lest he explode. He opened the first page and began. October 15th. I don't know how it started. I don't know when she stopped being my Sarah, but I've seen her with him. In a cafe, she was laughing like he was the center of her world. I can't tell her what I know. I can't ruin everything we have. Oliver and Emma don't suspect a thing. They paint our family as if we're still whole. But I see the cracks. I see her checking her phone, walking into another room to answer it. I see her new dresses, her smiles that aren't for me. I don't know what to do." He wrote quickly, almost feverishly, as if he were afraid that if he stopped, he would lose his resolve. The notebook became his refuge, a place where he could be honest without fear of judgment. He wrote about everything: Jason's messages, her late returns, her evasive answers. He wrote about watching her, seeing her with him, how her laughter cut him like a knife. He wrote about the children, their innocence, their joy, how he couldn't look at them without feeling like he was failing them. When he finished, his hand was shaking. He closed the book and hid it in a drawer under a stack of old blueprints. It was his secret, his way of dealing with the chaos that was consuming him from within. He didn't know if it would help, but at least for a moment he felt relief. That evening, after dinner, Sarah kept her promise and sat down on the sofa with Emma to read a story. Oliver, declaring that he was too old for this, sat down next to her anyway, pretending not to be interested. Michael sat in a chair, holding a magazine, but his eyes were fixed on Sarah. She read with expression, changing voices for different characters, and Emma giggled into her shoulder. It was the scene he loved most in the world. His family gathered together, full of warmth and comfort. But now it seemed false to him, like a theater set. "Mom, did the dragon really love the princess?" Emma asked as Sarah closed the book. "Maybe," Sarah answered, smiling. "Even dragons can love sometimes, but they don't always know how to show it." Michael felt his throat tighten. He stood up and went into the kitchen, unable to look at them any longer. He could hear Sarah talking to the children, Oliver teasing Emma, them laughing. It was unbearable. He opened the refrigerator, got a bottle of water, and took a few sips, trying to calm himself. But inside he was burning. Late that night, when the house was quiet, Michael took out his notebook again. He wrote in the dark, by the light of a desk lamp, trying not to wake Sarah, who was asleep in their bedroom. His handwriting was uneven, the words flowing. October 18th. Today she read Emma a story. They were laughing as if everything was fine. I looked at them and couldn't breathe. How can she be like this? How can she pretend that nothing is happening? I saw her with him today. She said she was going to a meeting with a client, but I was watching her. They were in a restaurant, sitting close, too close. She was touching his arm, laughing. I can't forget that. I can't look at the children without feeling like I've let them down. They don't know anything. They think we're happy. I don't know how much longer I can keep quiet. He closed the book and put it away, feeling the weariness creeping up on him. But sleep did not come. He lay in the dark, listening to the silence of the house, and wondered how long he could keep it all inside. The children knew nothing, and he would do anything to keep it that way. But the truth was like poison, slowly eating away at him from the inside. He didn't know how much longer he could bear before the web of lies he was caught in consumed him completely. Fall was in full swing in New Jersey, and the streets of Maplewood were covered in crimson and gold leaves that crunched underfoot, whispering change. The morning air was cool, with a hint of smoke from the neighbors' fireplaces, but Michael Davis was oblivious to the beauty. His world, once as solid as the concrete supports of the bridge he was working on, now felt fragile, ready to crumble at the slightest push. The text from Jason that he'd accidentally seen on Emma's iPad burned him like hot metal. The scene in the cafe, where Sarah had laughed with another man, touched his arm, looked at him in a way she'd only ever looked at Michael, wouldn't leave his mind. He didn't say a word to her. It wasn't because he didn't want to, he just couldn't. The words stuck in his throat like shards of glass, and he was afraid that if he spoke, everything they had spent 15 years building would crumble to dust. Oliver and Emma, their children, knew nothing, and Michael clung to their ignorance like a lifeline. But the silence was killing him, and he knew he had to do something. Michael sat in his car outside his lawyer's office, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. He wasn't sure he was ready for this. Going to a lawyer would be like admitting that their marriage, their family, their life might be over. But he couldn't just watch Sarah slip away, their perfect facade crumble, while he stood by. He had to protect himself, protect his children, and if that meant preparing for the worst, then so be it. The office was in the center of town, in an old brick building that looked like it had been around for generations. A sign reading Howard S. Miller, Family Law, hung over the entrance, slightly faded with age. Michael took a deep breath, got out of the car, and headed inside, his heart pounding in his chest like a hammer on an anvil. Inside, the office was modest but cozy. wood-paneled walls, worn gray carpet, the smell of coffee and old books. The secretary, an older woman with a friendly smile and glasses on a chain, showed him into the office. Howard Miller was a man in his 50s, with thick graying hair and tired but keen eyes. His suit was slightly rumpled, and his desk was piled high with files, but something about his manner inspired confidence, the quiet assurance of a man who had seen too much family drama to be surprised. He rose from his desk and extended his hand. "Mr. Davis, Howard Miller. Good to see you. Have a seat," he said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite. Michael shook his hand, feeling his palm tremble slightly, and sat down. He didn't know where to begin. Everything he'd been through in the last few weeks, the texts, the surveillance, the sleepless nights, felt too much to put into words. He cleared his throat, trying to gather his thoughts. "Thank you for seeing me so quickly," he began, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in days. I, I'm not quite sure why I'm here. I mean, I know, but it's hard to explain." Howard nodded, leaning back in his chair, his face calm but attentive, as if he had heard this story 1,000 times before. "Take your time, Michael," he said softly. "Tell me what's going on. I'm here to help you figure it out." Michael took a deep breath, looking down at his hands folded in his lap, his fingers nervously fiddling with the hem of his shirt sleeve. "My wife, Sarah. I think she's having an affair. I found messages on our daughter's iPad from some guy, Jason. They were different from the ones from her coworker. Personal. Too personal." He trailed off, his cheeks burning with shame. "I followed her. Saw them together. In a cafe, then in a restaurant." She laughed, touched him. "She doesn't know that I know. I haven't told her. I can't. We have 2 kids, Oliver and Emma, ages 10 and 7. I don't want to ruin their world. But I don't know how to live with this. I'm going crazy." Howard listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. His pen glided across his pad, jotting down quick notes. When Michael finished, he put the pen down and looked at him with sympathy, but without undue sentimentality. "This is a tough situation, Michael," he said, his voice even but warm. "I can see how much pain you're going through right now. Let's take this step by step. Are you sure you're ready to take legal steps, or are you still hoping to salvage the marriage?" Michael clenched his fists, looking at the floor. It was a question he asked himself every night, lying in the dark, listening to Sarah breathe. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "I want things to go back to the way they were. I still love her, but I can't trust her. Not after what I've seen, and I don't want the kids to get hurt. If it comes to divorce, I want to be prepared. I want to have a plan for them." Howard nodded, his gaze serious but not judgmental. "Okay, if you're considering divorce as a possible scenario, the first thing we need is evidence. I'm not saying you should go home and fight right now. That could complicate things, especially if it goes to court. Emotions are a bad advisor in these situations. You need to gather as many facts as possible. You mentioned messages. Do you have copies of them?" Michael shook his head, feeling stupid. "No, I saw them on the iPad, but I didn't save them. I didn't think I'd need them." "That's fine," Howard said, jotting down something in his notebook. "But if you want to be on solid ground, start documenting. Take screenshots, save conversations if you have access. If she's on a shared computer or phone where you can legally look, make copies of anything that looks suspicious. But be careful, don't hack into her accounts, don't do anything that could be considered illegal. It could come back to haunt you." Michael nodded, even though the thought of going through Sarah's things made him feel sick. He already felt like a traitor for spying on her, but Howard's words made sense. If he wanted to protect himself and the kids, he had to be smarter than that. "There's another option," Howard continued, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "You could install a camera in your home. It's legal in New Jersey as long as you put it in common areas like the kitchen and living room, but not in private spaces like the bedroom or bathroom. The camera could record her calls, her behavior if she's, say, talking on the phone with someone when she thinks no one can hear her. But I have to warn you, it can be hard. Seeing or hearing something that confirms your suspicions is different from just suspecting. Are you ready for that? Michael felt his stomach clench. A hidden camera? It was so far from the man he thought he was. He was an engineer, a father who fixed bikes and helped with homework. And now he was supposed to be a spy in his own home. But the idea that he could get irrefutable evidence was tempting. It gave him the sense of control he so desperately craved. "I'll think about it," he said quietly, looking at his hands. Howard nodded, his gaze sympathetic but businesslike. "I understand. It's not an easy decision, but if you decide to go this route, choose something discreet, a camera that won't attract attention. And one more thing, don't make a scene. Don't blame her, don't scream. If you give in to emotions, it can be used against you in court. Stay calm, gather the facts, and stay in control. That's the best way to protect yourself and the children." Michael pressed his lips together, nodding. Calm. How could he be calm when his world was falling apart? But he knew Howard was right. If he wanted Oliver and Emma to stay with him, if he wanted their lives to hold together, he had to keep a cool head. "What else do I need to know?" he asked, his voice almost mechanical. Howard sighed as he flipped through his notes. "Start with your finances. Make a list of all your assets, your house, your cars, your savings, your debts. Check your joint accounts. Sometimes in these situations, one spouse will start moving money or hiding income. This is not an accusation, just a precaution. And think about what you want for the kids. Full custody? Joint? Where will they live? These are tough questions, but they need to be thought through in advance. In New Jersey, the courts generally favor joint custody, but if you can show that Sarah is, say, unstable or that her behavior is affecting the children's well-being, that might tip the scales in your favor. But that requires evidence. Michael felt his throat tighten. Full custody? He couldn't imagine Oliver and Emma living without Sarah. She was a good mother, despite everything. But the thought of them growing up with Jason, the man who had destroyed their family, was unbearable. "I don't want to take them away from her," he said quietly, almost in a whisper. "But I don't want them to live with him, with the one who did this." Howard nodded, his gaze soft but professional. "I understand. We can work on this if it comes to court. But for now, your job is to gather evidence and not let your emotions get the better of you. Can you handle it?" Michael didn't answer right away. He looked at his hands, clenched into fists, and thought about how far he'd come. A month ago, he was just a husband and father, and now he was discussing hidden cameras and divorce. But he nodded. "Yes, I can handle it." Howard handed him a business card with his name and phone number written on it in gold letters. "If anything changes, call. And Michael, hang in there. It's tough, but you're not alone. I've seen a lot of these cases, and people find a way out. You will too." Michael took the card, muttered a thank you, and walked out of the office. The cool autumn air hit his face, but it didn't bring him any relief. He got into his car and sat there for a long time, staring at the dashboard, trying to process the conversation. Evidence, divorce, custody. The words sounded like something from someone else's life, but now they were his reality. The house was quiet. Sarah was at work, Oliver was at soccer practice, and Emma was at a friend's playdate. The silence was both a relief and a curse. It gave him space to think, but it only added to the chaos in his head. He went up to his office, locked the door, and pulled out the notebook he'd started jotting down his thoughts in a few days ago. He turned to a new page and began writing, his handwriting uneven, almost feverish. October 22nd. I saw a lawyer today, Howard Miller. He says we need proof texts, calls, anything to prove she cheated. Said we could set up a camera in the house. I feel sick just thinking about it, but what else can I do? She's still lying, pretending everything is fine. I saw her with him again yesterday, at a bar. They were laughing like they had no worries. I can't tell her what I know. Not now. I have to be smart for Oliver and Emma. He closed the notebook and tucked it under a stack of old blueprints. Then he opened his laptop and began searching for hidden cameras. The internet was full of options, tiny devices disguised as watches, picture frames, even smoke detectors. He felt dirty browsing the sites, but he pushed the guilt aside. This wasn't a betrayal, he told himself. This was protecting his family. He ordered a small camera that looked like a USB charger, something that wouldn't attract attention on the kitchen counter. It was due in 2 days. Then he decided to check Sarah's phone. He knew her password, Emma's birthday, but he hadn't dared to invade her privacy again until now. Guilt held him back, but Howard's words get the facts were like an order in his head. He waited until evening, when Sarah was in the shower and her phone was still on the nightstand. His hands shook as he typed in the password and opened the messaging app. The conversation with Jason was there, and it was longer. He scrolled up, his heart clenching with each word. Jason, you were amazing yesterday. I can't get you out of my head. Sarah, you're too sweet. I had a good time too. Jason, when will I see you again? I'm already counting the hours. Sarah, soon. I'll think of something. There were dozens of messages, some light and flirtatious, others more serious, with hints of real feelings and needing to figure things out. Michael felt his throat tighten, as if someone was squeezing it with an invisible hand. He took screenshots, emailed them to himself, and then deleted traces from her phone so she wouldn't suspect anything. He hated himself for it, but he couldn't stop. Each new piece of evidence was like poison, simultaneously destroying him and giving him a strange sense of control. He also checked her calls. Most of the numbers were familiar, her friends, her coworkers, her kids' school. But one number came up too often, and it wasn't saved in her contacts. Michael wrote it down in his address book, determined to find out later who it belonged to. He was almost certain it was Jason, but he wanted facts, not guesses. The camera arrived 2 days later in a nondescript box. Michael waited until Sarah had left for work and the kids were at school and set it up in the kitchen on a shelf next to the coffee machine. It was the perfect spot. It looked like a regular charging pad, but it recorded everything that happened in the room. He connected it to an app on his phone that let him view the footage in real time. The picture was crisp, the sound clear. He felt both powerful and pathetic, like he was in a cheap detective show. That evening, Sarah returned home late, citing another client meeting. Michael nodded as usual, but his eyes followed her as she took off her coat and set her bag on the kitchen table. She picked up her phone and went into the living room, saying she needed to respond to an urgent message. Michael waited until she returned, then checked the camera footage. In the video, Sarah was sitting on the couch, her fingers quickly running across the screen of her phone, a small smile on her face. She typed something, then put the phone in her pocket as if nothing had happened. Michael saved the footage, adding it to the growing evidence folder on his laptop. The next few days were a blur. Michael kept his notebook, recording every detail. The times Sarah left and returned, her excuses, her behavior. He wrote about how she dressed up more often, how her new perfume filled the house with an unfamiliar scent, how she took the phone into another room when an unknown number rang. He wrote about the children, their laughter, their innocence, their drawings that tore at his heart. He wrote about his pain, how he couldn't look at them without feeling like he was letting them down. One evening, while Sarah was reading Emma a story and Oliver was sitting there pretending not to care, Michael couldn't take it anymore and went into the garage. He picked up a plane and began to plane a board, although he had no plan for what to do with it. The movement, the sound, the smell of the wood, it was the only thing that helped drown out the chaos in his head. But even there, among the tools, he couldn't stop thinking about her, about Jason, about how their family was slowly falling apart. He returned home late, when everyone was already asleep. He sat down in his office and opened his notebook, adding another entry. October 25th. She was with him again. I checked her location, a restaurant in the city center. I didn't go after her, I couldn't. The camera in the kitchen recorded her talking on the phone today. She laughed, called him cute. I saved the video. I don't know how much longer I can keep quiet. Oliver asked me today why I was sad. I lied, said I was tired. I don't want them to know. I don't want them to see their world crumble. But I don't know how to stop it. He closed the book and put it away, feeling the weariness creeping up on him. But sleep did not come. He lay in the dark, listening to the silence of the house, and wondered how long he could keep it all inside. The children knew nothing, and he would do anything to keep it that way. But the truth was like poison, slowly eating away at him from the inside. He didn't know how much longer he could bear before the web of lies he was caught in consumed him completely. November arrived in New Jersey with cold winds that stripped the last leaves from the maple trees along Maplewood Street. The Davis house, with its blue shutters and neatly trimmed lawn, still looked like a picture-perfect home lifestyle magazine, but inside, the walls were soaking with tension, like a sponge soaking up water. Michael could no longer look at Sarah without feeling his heart torn between pain and rage. He had remained silent for weeks, collecting evidence of her betrayal like evidence for an invisible trial. Screenshots of Jason's text messages, footage from the kitchen camera, photos taken from his car while he had followed her into the bar. It all sat in a folder on his laptop, tucked away under the innocent title Bridge Plans. He hadn't wanted to do this, but each new piece of truth pushed him closer to the edge. Today, when Sarah had been late again, he realized he couldn't keep it inside any longer. It was almost 9 o'clock when the front door creaked softly. Michael was sitting in the living room, in the semi-darkness, lit only by the dim light of a desk lamp. The kids were asleep. Oliver, exhausted from soccer practice, tucked into a pillow in his room, and Emma hugging her stuffed unicorn as if it could protect her from all harm. Michael held a glass of water in his hands, although inside he was screaming for something stronger. He hadn't had anything but coffee in years, but right now the thought of whiskey was almost tangible. On the coffee table was his notebook, open to the last page, where he had described the evening before. Sarah at the bar with Jason, her laughter, her hand on his shoulder. Next to him was his phone, with a photo open to it, the one of them sitting at the table, too close, too happy. Sarah came into the living room, taking off her coat. Her blonde hair was slightly tousled by the wind, her cheeks were pink from the cold, and there was a lively, almost sparkling light in her eyes that Michael had not seen for a long time. She looked tired, but not exhausted, more like someone who had just returned from some secret celebration. This only increased his pain. "Oh, you're still awake," she said, hanging her coat on the hook by the door. Her voice was light, almost playful, as if she were trying to lighten the mood. "I thought you'd be in bed. Are the kids in bed?" Michael didn't answer right away. He looked at her, trying to find in her face the Sarah he'd known 15 years ago, the one who'd laughed at his stupid jokes, who'd held his hand in the hospital when their children were born. But this was a different woman, and the mask she'd worn so skillfully was beginning to crack at the seams. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice low, almost calm, but there was steel in it, ready to break through. Sarah froze, her hand still holding her bag. She looked at him, her eyebrows raised slightly, as if she was surprised by his tone. "At work," she replied, setting her bag on the floor and straightening her shoulders. "We had a meeting with a client. I told you this morning." Michael nodded slowly, his fingers gripping the phone so tightly it almost cracked. He could feel his pulse pounding in his temples, as if counting down the seconds until it exploded. "A client meeting," he repeated, his voice even but bitter like poison in wine. "At 9 o'clock, in a bar." Sarah frowned, her gaze becoming wary. She crossed her arms over her chest, as if putting up an invisible wall. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice sharpening, a hint of irritation. "Yeah, we finished late, and the crew decided to have a drink." "That's fine, Michael. What kind of interrogation are you having? Are you having a bad day or something?" He stood up, slowly, as if every movement required great effort from him. His eyes never left her face, trying to catch even the slightest hint of truth, but her gaze was firm, almost defiant. "The team," he said, his voice quiet but heavy, like a stone falling into water. "Was Jason on that team too?" Her face paled, but she quickly pulled herself together. She sat up straight, her eyes flashing as if he were challenging her. "Jason," she asked, her tone almost mocking, but there was a hint of nervousness in it. This is my colleague, Michael. We're working on a project together. Are you going to be suspicious of everyone I have coffee with now? This is ridiculous. Michael felt his blood boil. Her words sounded so smooth, so rehearsed, as if she had been preparing for this conversation. He took a step closer, his voice lower, but it trembled with suppressed fury. A colleague, he said, almost whispering, but each word hit like a hammer. Then why do you meet him in bars? Why does he text you that he can't stop thinking about you? Why do you look at him the way you used to look at me? Her eyes widened, and for a second something flashed in them: fear, guilt, maybe both. But she recovered quickly, her jaw tightening, and she took a step toward him, her voice rising. "You read my messages?" she blurted out, her tone sharp as a blade. "Are you serious, Michael? Are you going through my phone like some kind of paranoid person? Is this what's going to happen now? Are you going to spy on me like I'm a criminal?" "Don't you dare turn this on me," he snapped, his voice rising to a scream as he tried to keep his composure. "I saw you, Sarah. I saw you together. At the bar, at the restaurant. You laughed, touched him, looked at him as if I didn't exist for you." He lifted his phone, and the screen lit up, showing a photograph. Sarah and Jason at a bar, sitting close, her hand on his arm, her smile brighter than he'd seen it in months. She froze, staring at the image, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, the room was silent, so heavy it felt like it could crush them both. "It's not what you think," she finally said, her voice quieter but still firm, as if she were clinging to a last line of defense. "It was just dinner, with coworkers. You take one moment and make a big deal out of it." Michael let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. His hands were shaking, but he didn't take his eyes off her. "Dinner with coworkers," he said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Sarah, I have more than that. I have your texts. You're amazing. I can't get you out of my head. He texted you, and you texted back. It was good for me too. I have videos of you in the kitchen, giggling, calling him cute. I've been watching you, Sarah. More than once. I've seen you. Don't tell me I made this up." Her face twisted as if he had struck her. She stepped back, her arms falling to her sides, her eyes glistening with tears, but still blazing with anger. "You were following me?" Her voice rose to a scream of rage and pain. "You put a camera in our house? Jesus, Michael, do you even realize how crazy this is? You turned our house into a fucking spy base. You're going through my things, spying on me, taking pictures like some kind of psycho. How can you do this to me?" "How can I?" he screamed back, his voice echoing off the walls. "You're the one lying to me, Sarah. You're running after some man while I'm here trying to hold our family together. You think I wanted this? You think I enjoy tracking you down like a thief? I did it because you gave me a choice. You're ruining everything we had for this Jason." Sarah turned away, her shoulders shaking. She went to the window, looking out at the dark street, where the streetlights cast long shadows. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, almost broken, but there was steel in it. "You don't understand," she said, without turning around. "You think this is just about some guy. You think I just decided to ruin everything because I was bored? I'm unhappy, Michael. I've been unhappy for years. You didn't see it because it was convenient for you not to notice. You were busy with your bridges, your plans, your deadlines. And me, I was drowning." Michael felt her words hit him like a fist in the chest. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck. He looked at her hunched shoulders, at her reflection in the dark window, and for the first time in weeks he saw not just lies, but pain. "Drowning?" he asked, his voice quieter, but still shaking with anger. "Sarah, I worked so we could have this house, so the kids could have everything they needed. I tried to be a good husband, a good father, and you ran to the first guy who said a few compliments to you. That's your excuse?" She turned sharply, her eyes burning, tears rolling down her cheeks, but she did not try to wipe them away. "That's not an excuse," she screamed. "It's the truth. You think I just wanted compliments? I wanted to feel alive, Michael. I wanted someone to see me, not just a wife who cooked dinners and drove the kids to practice. You stopped seeing me. You stopped asking how my day was, how I was feeling. You were there, but you weren't. And Jason, he listened. He noticed. Michael felt his throat tighten. Her words were like a knife, stabbing deeper. He wanted to scream that she was lying, that she had betrayed him, but somewhere deep inside he knew there was truth to her words. He remembered how rarely they had spoken truly in recent years, how their conversations had been about the kids' schedules and bills. But that didn't excuse her. It couldn't. "So it's my fault," he said, his voice hoarse, almost broken. "I worked, I tried, and you went to seek comfort from someone else. Do you even realize what you've done to us? To Oliver, to Emma? They don't know anything, Sarah. They paint us as a happy family, and you're ruining it all." Sarah covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. She sank down onto the couch as if her strength had left her. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to hurt them. I didn't mean to hurt you. But I don't know how to fix it. I don't know who I am anymore." Michael looked at her, his heart torn between rage and pity. He wanted to go over to her, to hug her, to tell her they could get through this, but the image of her with Jason, her laughter, her lies, stood before his eyes like a wall. "You should have told me," he said finally, his voice cold but hurt. "If you were unhappy, you should have come to me, not run to him, not lie to my face." Sarah looked up, her eyes red from crying but still defiant. "Would you listen?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Would you stop for a second to hear me? Or would you just say you had a deadline, you were tired, we'd talk later? Because that's all I've heard for years, Michael. Later. And I couldn't wait any longer." He opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He felt like he was backed into a wall and didn't know how to get out. He looked at her, the woman he loved more than anything in the world, and saw a stranger in her. The perfect facade they had built so carefully had crumbled, and now they stood in the rubble, unsure of what to do next. "What now?" he asked finally, his voice empty, as if all emotion had burned out. "What do you want, Sarah? To go to him? To leave us? Because I don't know how we can go on after this." She shook her head, her hands still shaking. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know what I want, but I know I don't want to lose the kids. And I don't want you to hate me." Michael felt his eyes sting with tears, but he clenched his teeth, not letting them escape. He turned and walked into the kitchen, leaving her alone in the living room. He couldn't look at her anymore, couldn't listen to her voice. He stood at the sink, looking at the empty glass in his hands, and he felt their world, their family, their life falling apart. And the worst thing was, he didn't know how to stop it. After the row in the living room, when Sarah's mask finally fell, their lives changed irreversibly. Michael couldn't forget her tears, her words about her unhappiness, her accusations that he hadn't noticed her. But even more deeply imprinted in his memory were her meetings with Jason, her lies, her laughter that was no longer his. He didn't throw her out, didn't demand that she leave, but the day after their conversation, Sarah herself announced that she needed time to think. By the end of the week, she had packed her suitcase and said she was moving to a rented apartment downtown. Michael didn't argue. He was too exhausted to fight, too angry to ask her to stay. The children, Oliver and Emma, knew nothing of the reasons. Their world was still full of soccer practice, school projects, and bedtime stories, and Michael had done his best to maintain that fragile sliver of normality. But now that Sarah was preparing to leave, he knew they would have to explain to the children why their mother would no longer be living with them. He dreaded this conversation more than anything in his life. Saturday morning was gray and overcast, as if the sky had decided to reflect the mood of the house. Michael had woken early, before his alarm, and lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Sarah had been sleeping in the spare room for the past few days, avoiding his gaze and limiting their conversation to short conversations about the children and household chores. He could hear her fussing around downstairs, gathering up the last of her things. The suitcase was already by the door, black, with a worn handle, the same one they had taken on their vacation to Lake Michigan 5 years ago. They were happy then. Now it was a symbol of their ruin. Michael came down to the kitchen where Sarah was making coffee. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes, but her movements were as precise as ever. She noticed him but didn't look up, continuing to stir the sugar in her mug. "I'll talk to the children today," she said quietly, not looking at him. "They need to know I'm leaving. I don't want them to think I've abandoned them." Michael nodded, his throat tightening. He wanted to say something harsh, to remind her that she was the one who had destroyed their family, but instead he simply replied, "Okay, but I'll be there. They need to hear it from both of us." Sarah finally looked at him, her eyes empty, as if she was burned out from the inside. "I'm not going to make a scene, Michael. I'll just tell them I need some time apart. They can't know the rest of it." "They won't know," he snapped, his voice cold but firm. "Not from me, but you have to be as honest as you can. They deserve it." She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line, and turned away to the window. Michael looked at her, trying to find the woman he loved, but he saw only a shadow. He went into the living room to collect his thoughts before waking the children. Oliver and Emma were sitting at the kitchen table when Sarah and Michael called them over for a chat. Oliver, wearing his favorite Manchester United t-shirt, was lazily munching on toast and leafing through a comic book. Emma, in her unicorn pajamas, was doodling on a piece of paper and humming a song. Michael looked at them, and his heart ached. They were so carefree, so innocent, and he hated Sarah for making him ruin their world. But he hated himself, too, for not being able to stop it. "Guys," Sarah began, her voice soft but shaky, like she was teetering on the edge. "Dad and I need to talk to you. It's important." Oliver looked up from the comic, his brows furrowing. "What happened?" he asked, his voice wary. "Did you two fight again?" Emma stopped drawing, her pencil hovering over the paper. Her big blue eyes looked at Sarah, then at Michael. "You're not getting divorced, are you?" she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. Michael felt his throat tighten. He wanted to say that everything would be okay, but the words stuck. Sarah beat him to it, leaning toward Emma and taking her hand. "No, honey, we're not getting a divorce," she said, her voice soft but with a lie that Michael noticed right away. "But I need some time apart. I have a lot of work, and I need a place where I can focus. That doesn't mean I don't love you. I'll always be your mom, and we'll see each other often." Oliver put the comic down, his face becoming serious, almost adult. "Why can't you work here?" he asked, his voice harsh, as if he were trying to hide his pain. "We have a big house. You always said you liked it here." Sarah swallowed, her fingers squeezing Emma's hand a little tighter. "Ollie, it's hard to explain," she said, her voice shaking. "Sometimes adults need a little space to sort out their own things. But I'll come pick you up from school. We'll spend time together. Nothing will change." "Everything will change," Oliver said, his voice growing louder. "You're leaving, Mom. It's not the same anymore. Why can't you stay?" Michael saw Sarah struggling with herself, her eyes shining with tears. He wanted to intervene, to say something to soften the blow, but his own pain was in the way. He cleared his throat, getting the children's attention. "Guys," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, "Mom is telling the truth. She loves you very much, and that won't change. She'll be here, she'll just live somewhere else. We agreed that you'll stay here with us, because this is your home, your school, your friends. But Mom will always be a part of your life." Emma looked at him, her eyes full of tears. "But why can't she live with us?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I don't want Mom to leave. I want everything to be like before." Michael felt his heart break. He leaned towards her, stroking her head. "I know, honey," he said quietly. "I want things to be like they used to be, too. But sometimes grown-ups do hard things to make things better. Mom will come over, read you stories, pick you up from dances, and I'll always be here with you. We'll get through this." Sarah looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude, but also guilt. She knew he was lying for the children, that he was doing everything he could to protect them from the truth. She let go of Emma's hand and stood up, her movements jerky, as if she was afraid that in another second she would break. I'll go and pack the last of my things, she said, her voice barely audible. Ollie, Emma, I'll call you tomorrow, okay? We'll go to a cafe, have some ice cream. Oliver didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the table. Emma nodded, but her eyes were full of tears. Sarah went upstairs, leaving Michael alone with the children. He looked at them, at their confused faces, and felt helpless. He wanted to protect them, but he didn't know how. Sarah left by midday. She hugged the children, kissed the tops of their heads, and promised to call that evening. Michael stood to the side, watching her car drive away down the street. The suitcase in the trunk, her silhouette behind the wheel, it all seemed like a scene from someone else's movie. He went back into the house, closed the door, and leaned against the wall, feeling the fatigue pressing down on him like a heavy weight. He spent the rest of the day with the kids, trying to keep his temper under control. Oliver was quiet, going to his room and playing a video game, but Michael could hear him sniffling every now and then. Emma, on the other hand, stayed close to him, snuggling into his side as they watched the cartoon. She didn't ask any questions, but her silence spoke louder than any words. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Michael sat in his study and opened his notebook. He had been writing for weeks, pouring out his thoughts, his pain, his fears. Now he added a new entry. November 4th. She left. She told the kids she needed some space. Oliver is angry, Emma is crying, but they don't know the truth. I won't tell them. I can't. They can't know their mother betrayed us. I try to be honest, but how can I be honest without hurting them? I told them she loved them, that she would be there for them. But I don't know if I believe it myself. The house feels empty without her, but her presence was a lie. I don't know how to go on. He closed the book and hid it in a drawer. Then he checked the camera in the kitchen. It was still working, although there was no point in it now. He saved all the notes, all the screenshots, all the photos in a folder on his laptop. He didn't know if he'd need them, but the words of his lawyer, Howard Miller, echoed in his head. Gather evidence. He was prepared for the worst, but he hoped it wouldn't come to that. The next day, Sarah called as she had promised. She was on speakerphone with the kids, her voice cheerful, but Michael could hear the tension in it. She offered to pick them up on Sunday to go to the park. Oliver grunted something in response, and Emma perked up, but her voice was quiet. Michael sat nearby, watching them, and felt his heart break. He wanted them to be happy, but he didn't know how that was possible when their family was torn apart. When the conversation ended, he looked at the children and said, "Everything will be fine, guys. We can handle it. Together." But deep down, he wasn't sure that was true. Their lives were divided into before and after, and he didn't know how to glue the pieces back together. He just knew he had to be strong for Oliver, for Emma, for their world to not fall apart completely. The Davis house, with its blue shutters and neat porch, still looked like an oasis of domesticity, but inside it was different. Without Sarah, whose absence now felt like a gaping hole, the house seemed quieter, despite the children's laughter and the clatter of Oliver and Emma's feet. Michael, left alone with the children after Sarah moved into her own apartment downtown, had tried to keep their lives from falling apart. He hadn't told them the truth about her affair, about the scandal that had torn their family apart, but every morning, when he woke up in an empty bed, he felt the truth pressing down on him like a slab of concrete. And yet he knew he had to be strong for Oliver and Emma, for the little world he was trying so hard to keep together. The first weeks without Sarah were chaotic, like trying to build a bridge without plans. Michael, accustomed to sharing responsibilities with his wife, suddenly found himself alone against the storms of everyday life. School assemblies, Oliver's soccer practice, Emma's dance classes, dinners to cook, and his own work, which required attention to detail. But gradually, step by step, he began to find a rhythm imperfect but steady. The children, despite their confusion and longing for their mother, felt safe with him, and that was the only thing that kept him from despairing. The first morning without Sarah was Monday, and it started with disaster. Michael had slept through his alarm because he'd spent half the night staring at the ceiling, replaying their last conversation in his head. When he finally made it down to the kitchen, Oliver was already sitting at the table, scowling at his cereal bowl, and Emma, in her unicorn pajamas, was trying to pour herself some juice and spilling half of it on the floor. "Dad, we're going to be late," Oliver said, his voice irritated but filled with worry. "I have a math test today, and you're not even dressed yet." Michael looked at his watch and cursed under his breath. It was 7:15, and the school bus was at 7:40. He rushed to pack his lunches, but found that there was almost nothing in the fridge, just a couple of yogurts, half a loaf of bread, and some jam that Emma hated. "Oliver, have a yogurt," he said, trying to hide his panic. "Emma, you like apples, right? I'll put an apple in." Emma grimaced, her eyes full of disbelief. "My mom always made me peanut butter sandwiches," she said, her voice quiet but hurt. "Why can't you?" Michael froze, his hand hovering over his lunch bag, holding the apple. He wanted to say that Mom wasn't here anymore, that she'd left, but instead he just nodded. "I'll do it tomorrow, sunshine. I promise. Today we'll make do with an apple, okay?" Emma didn't answer, but her look spoke louder than words. Michael felt a pang of guilt, but there was no time to think. He helped the children pack their backpacks, braided Emma's hair, and it came out crooked, but Emma graciously said nothing, and they ran out to the bus a minute before it arrived. Michael came back into the house, breathing hard, and looked at the kitchen. The table was covered in crumbs, the floor was sticky with juice, and his own work was waiting for him in the office, where he was already late for a meeting. The workday was no better. Michael, a bridge engineer, was used to precision and order, but his mind was elsewhere than on the drawings. He had miscalculated the load on a support, and a colleague, noticing it, gently pointed it out, but Michael felt as if he had been publicly humiliated. He apologized, promised to fix it, but only one thing was spinning in his head. How was he going to cope with all this alone? That evening, he picked up Emma from dancing and Oliver from practice and tried to cook dinner. His repertoire was limited to scrambled eggs and macaroni and cheese, but he decided to try something more complicated: chicken and vegetables, like Sarah had made. The result was disastrous. The chicken was burnt and the vegetables were mush. Oliver snorted, looking at the plate. "Dad, is this always going to be like this?" he asked, his tone half joking, but his eyes filled with concern. Michael forced himself to smile, even though his insides were clenching. "Not always, Ollie. I'm learning. Give me a couple of days, and I'll be a chef." Emma giggled, but her laugh wasn't as loud as it used to be. Michael watched them, their attempts at bravery, and felt his heart break. He wanted to give them a normal life, but so far everything he did seemed like a clumsy parody of what had come before. A week passed, and Michael began to find ways to cope. He made a schedule like a blueprint at work: wake up at 6:30, breakfast at 7 o'clock, bus at 7:40, work until 5 o'clock, then club, dinner, homework, sleep. He wrote it all down on a piece of paper and taped it to the refrigerator to keep track. Lunch became simpler peanut butter sandwiches for Emma, turkey and cheese for Oliver, plus fruit and juice. He even learned how to braid Emma's hair from watching a few YouTube videos, though she still grumbled that her mother did it better. Work also became a problem. His boss, noticing that Michael had become absent-minded, called him in for a talk. Michael expected a reprimand, but instead received sympathy. "Listen, Michael, I know things are tough for you at home right now," said Bob, an older engineer with a thick mustache. "If you need to take a few days off or work from home, let me know. We'll get through this." Michael thanked her but declined. He needed to keep his composure, and work, with all its routine, was the anchor that kept him from drowning. He began arriving at the office earlier so he could finish his calculations before picking up the kids. It meant less sleep, but he had grown accustomed to the fatigue. The children, despite their longing for Sarah, began to adjust. Sarah called every night, her voice on speakerphone filling the kitchen with a warmth Michael tried to ignore. She picked them up on Sundays as promised, and they returned from the park with ice cream on their t-shirts and stories of their mother taking them on the carousel. Michael listened, nodding, but inside he was seething. He hated her for being so cheerful with them, after all she had done. But he kept it to himself, not letting the children see his pain. By the end of November, Michael was beginning to feel like his life was settling into a new rhythm. It wasn't the life he wanted, but it was steady, like a temporary bridge that holds until a permanent one is built. He'd learned to cook simple meals, spaghetti with meat sauce, baked chicken, even a pizza from a pre-made crust that Emma declared almost like a restaurant. He'd become better at managing his time, picking up Oliver from practice and Emma from dance without being late for work. He'd even found time to help Oliver with a science project. They built a model volcano that erupted with baking soda and vinegar, and Oliver, usually reserved, couldn't hide his pride when he got an A. The children, despite their confusion, felt safe around him. Michael noticed it in small ways. The way Emma snuggled close to him while they watched cartoons, the way Oliver began asking him for soccer advice more often, rather than simply retreating to his room. They still missed Sarah. Emma sometimes cried herself to sleep, and Oliver became quieter when she called, but they knew Michael was there. That gave them a sense of security, and Michael clung to it like a lifeline. One night, as they sat eating dinner, spaghetti and meatballs, which Michael had finally learned to make without burning, Oliver looked at him and said, "Dad, you're like a superhero now. You do everything yourself." Michael laughed, genuinely for the first time in weeks. "A superhero," he said with a wink. "More like a guy trying not to ruin his spaghetti." Emma giggled, her eyes shining. "You're better than spaghetti, Dad, but Mom still makes it better." Michael felt a twinge of pain, but smiled. "Well, then I'll train until I overtake my mother. Do you agree?" Emma nodded, and Oliver rolled his eyes, but the corners of his lips twitched into a smile. Michael looked at them, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe they could do this. Not right away, not easily, but they would find their way. Late at night, when the children were asleep, Michael sat in his office and opened his notebook. He wrote almost every night, pouring out his thoughts to keep from going crazy. Today he wrote, November 28th. "It's been almost a month since she left. I'm starting to get used to it. It's hard, but I'm coping. The kids are okay, as much as they can be. They laugh, do their homework, argue like they used to. I try to be everything to them, but sometimes I feel like it's not the same. They miss her, and I can't blame them. I miss her, too, not the Sarah who lied to me, but the one who was my wife. But I can't think about that. I have to be strong. For them." He closed the book and tucked it away in a drawer. Then he checked his laptop. The evidence folder was still there, untouched. He hadn't opened it since Sarah left, but he knew he wouldn't delete it. Not now. Not when their family's future still hung in the balance. But in that moment, looking out at the sleeping house, he allowed himself to believe that maybe they could build a new rhythm, not perfect, but their own. Winter arrived in Maplewood, New Jersey, with the first snowfalls, covering the lawns in a thin layer of white fluff that the children immediately began to mold into snowballs. The Davis household, despite Sarah's absence, began to find a new rhythm, fragile but steady. Michael, now a single father, learned to juggle school, clubs, and his job, finding strange comfort in it. Oliver and Emma, though they missed their mother, felt safe with him, and that was the only thing keeping him from despairing. But the shadow of the past still loomed over their lives. The divorce from Sarah, now inevitable, was approaching like a blizzard, ready to crash into their fragile world. Sarah, who had moved into a rented apartment in the city center, initially called the children every evening, picked them up on weekends, and took them to the park or a cafe. But her calls became less frequent and their visits shorter. Michael noticed that Oliver became more silent after her visits, and Emma increasingly asked when her mother would be home. He didn't know how to answer without lying or hurting them. And then a letter from her lawyer arrived. Sarah had filed for divorce and was asking for joint custody of the children. It was a punch in the gut. Michael knew he had to fight not for revenge, but for Oliver and Emma, to keep their lives stable. He pulled out a folder of evidence, screenshots of messages, footage from the kitchen camera, photos of her meetings with Jason, and called Howard Miller, his lawyer, again. The trial was scheduled for early December, and Michael felt time tightening around him like a steel hoop. Howard Miller's office was the same. Wood paneling, the smell of coffee, stacks of files on the desk. But now Michael felt less like a bewildered husband and more like a man ready to protect his family. He had brought his laptop and a folder of evidence he had spent months collecting. Howard adjusted his glasses and studied the contents. Screenshots of Sarah's text messages with Jason, videos of her talking on the phone, laughing, calling him cute, photos from a bar where they had sat too close. Michael had also found a witness, Sarah's coworker Linda, who had agreed to testify that Jason was not just a coworker but her boss, and that their relationship at work had been the subject of whispers behind her back. "That's strong evidence, Michael," Howard said, leaning back in his chair. His voice was even, but there was confidence in it. In New Jersey, the courts don't always take adultery into account when dividing property, but a parent's behavior does matter when determining custody. If we can show that Sarah has been, let's say, irresponsible, that could tip the scales in your favor. But are you sure you want full custody? That's a big step. Courts generally favor joint custody. Michael clenched his fists, his gaze fixed on the folder on the table. "I don't want to take the kids away from her," he said quietly but firmly. "She's their mother, but I can't have them living with her if she's with him. I don't trust her, Howard. She lied to me for months, running after this Jason guy while I was trying to hold our family together. Oliver and Emma deserve stability. They're happy with me in our home. I don't want their lives turned upside down." Howard nodded, making notes on his notepad. "I understand. We'll emphasize that you're providing a stable environment for the children. Your evidence, the correspondence, the video, Linda's testimony will help show that Sarah was distracted from her parental responsibilities. But be prepared. Her lawyer will defend herself. They may try to accuse you of surveillance, saying that you violated her privacy. We have to be careful that this doesn't backfire on you." Michael felt his stomach clench. He knew what he was doing the camera, the surveillance was on the edge. But he saw no other way out. "I did it for the children," he said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't want them to grow up in a house where their mother lies. If the court decides I was wrong, I'll accept it, but I can't let her take them." Howard looked at him sympathetically. "I understand, Michael. We'll build a strong defense. Do you have a schedule for how you care for the kids? School, activities, dinners? That will show that you're the primary caregiver. And be prepared for Sarah to tell her side of the story. She may say she was unhappy, that you were distant. The judge will listen to both sides." Michael nodded, though the thought of Sarah blaming him in court was unbearable. He knew she was right about one thing: their marriage hadn't been perfect, but that didn't excuse her betrayal. "I'm ready," he said, although everything inside him screamed that he was not ready for anything. The courtroom in downtown Maplewood was cold and sterile, with tall windows that let in the gray winter light. Michael sat next to Howard, dressed in the dark suit he only wore to weddings and funerals. Across from him sat Sarah, her blonde hair pulled back into a neat bun, her face paler than usual. She avoided his gaze, looking down at her hands, folded on the table. Her lawyer, a middle-aged woman with sharp features, was whispering in her ear. Michael felt his heart pounding, but he tried to keep his temper. He thought of Oliver and Emma, who were at school, unaware that their futures were being decided in this room. The judge, an older woman with tired eyes and a stern expression, began the hearing. Howard presented their case first, emphasizing that Michael had been the children's primary caregiver since Sarah left. He described the schedule Michael had set for Oliver and Emma, driving them to practice and dances, cooking dinners, helping with homework. Then he turned to evidence. "Your Honor," Howard said, his voice confident but not aggressive, "my client, Michael Davis, has found that his wife, Sarah Davis, has engaged in inappropriate behavior during their marriage. We have evidence of her infidelity, including text messages with another man, videotapes of her conversations, and testimony from a coworker who will confirm that Mrs. Davis had an affair with her boss at work. This behavior indicates that she was not paying due attention to her parental responsibilities." Sarah's lawyer, Miss Crow, immediately objected. "Your Honor, My client does not deny that their marriage was troubled, but the allegations against her are exaggerated. Mrs. Davis is a loving mother who regularly communicates with her children and spends time with them. My client claims that Mr. Davis violated her privacy by installing hidden cameras in their home and spying on her. This behavior indicates his own instability. Michael felt his cheeks heat up. He knew the surveillance would be brought up in court, but it was still humiliating. Howard, however, was prepared. "Your Honor, my client acted in the best interests of his children," he said. He discovered evidence of Mrs. Davis's infidelity and was forced to document it in order to protect the stability of his children. All recordings were made in the common areas of their home, which is entirely in accordance with New Jersey law. The judge nodded, her face unreadable. She asked for evidence. Howard showed transcripts of Jason texting Sarah, "You're amazing, I can't get you out of my head," and her replying, "I had a good time too." Then he played video from the kitchen camera, Sarah sitting on the couch, laughing, calling someone cute on the phone. Finally, Sarah's coworker, Linda, testified via video link, confirming that Sarah's affair with Jason, her boss, was the subject of office gossip. Sarah sat silently, her face as pale as the snow outside. She didn't look at Michael, but he could see her hands shaking. When it was time for her to speak, she stood up, her voice quiet but firm. "Your Honor, I'm not a perfect mother or a perfect wife," she said, her eyes downcast. "I've made mistakes, but I love my children. Oliver and Emma are everything to me. I left home to figure myself out, but I never stopped being their mother. I'm asking for joint custody so they can grow up with both of us." Michael looked at her, his heart torn between pity and anger. He knew she loved the children, but he couldn't forgive her for lying, for betraying her. He didn't want to take Oliver and Emma away from her, but he couldn't trust her with their future. The judge heard both sides, reviewed the evidence, and reserved her decision for a week. Michael left the courtroom feeling drained. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew he'd done all he could. A week later, Michael was back in the courtroom, his suit now feeling tight, as if it was squeezing his chest. Sarah was there, her face even paler than before. The judge walked in, her gaze stern but fair. After considering all the evidence and testimony, she began, her voice clear as a bell. "The court finds that Mr. Michael Davis provides a stable and safe environment for the children, Oliver and Emma Davis. The evidence presented by Mr. Davis indicates that Mrs. Sarah Davis has engaged in inappropriate behavior that may have impacted her parenting responsibilities. The court orders that primary custody of the children remains with Mr. Davis. Mrs. Davis is entitled to regular visitation on an agreed-upon schedule." Michael felt the air leave his lungs. He had won, but the victory was not satisfying. He looked at Sarah, who had her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Her lawyer was whispering something to her, but she was not responding. Michael wanted to feel satisfaction, but instead he felt only emptiness. A few days after the trial, Michael learned from Linda that Sarah had lost her job. Rumors of her affair with Jason, her boss, had spread like wildfire through the office. Clients began asking questions, coworkers were whispering, and the company, not wanting a scandal, asked her to leave. Linda, who was still in contact with Michael, said Sarah looked devastated as she gathered her things from the office. Michael didn't know how to take the news. Part of him wanted her to suffer, to feel that she had lost not only her family, but also the career she valued so much. But another part of him, the part that still remembered their early years, their laughter, their dreams, felt sorry. He hadn't spoken to her since the trial, but Oliver and Emma had told him that their mother looked sad when she picked them up for the weekend. One evening, while the children were sleeping, Michael received a message from Sarah. It was short, but full of pain. "Michael, I know you hate me. I messed everything up. I didn't mean for this to happen. I just want to be a good mom to Oliver and Emma. Please don't take them away from me completely." He stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He wanted to say something harsh, to remind her of her lies, of Jason, of how she had destroyed their family. But instead, he simply closed the phone and walked into his office. He opened the notebook he had been writing in for months and added a new entry. December 12th. The court left the children with me. I should be happy, but I can't. Sarah lost her job, and I can see that she regrets it. But I can't forgive her. Not now. Oliver and Emma are fine, they laugh, they do their homework, but I know they miss her. I try to be everything for them, but sometimes I feel that it's not enough. I don't know what will happen next, but I know that I have to protect them. That's all that matters. He closed the book and tucked it away in the drawer. Snow was falling outside, covering Maplewood in a soft white blanket. Michael watched it, feeling his life, despite the pain, begin to take shape. It wasn't the life he wanted, but it was his life, and he would do anything to make Oliver and Emma feel safe in it. Winter in Maplewood, New Jersey, was slowly giving way to spring in 2026. The snow that had recently covered the lawns and sidewalks had melted, leaving behind damp earth and the first green shoots. The Davis house, with its blue shutters and neat porch, began to come alive again, filled with the laughter of children and a new, unfamiliar warmth. Michael, who had survived a divorce, a trial, and months of loneliness, had finally found a steady rhythm in his life as a single father. Oliver and Emma, despite missing their mother, were happy with him, and their smiles became a beacon for him in the stormy seas of the past year. Sarah, although still a part of their lives, was now more of a visitor than a constant presence. They saw her regularly on weekends, at school events, even celebrating Christmas and Thanksgiving together, trying to maintain a fragile semblance of a family for the sake of their children. But the house on Maplewood Street belonged to Michael and the children, and he made sure it became their refuge. Michael was no longer the broken man who spent months writing in his journal about the pain and betrayal. He wasn't bitter, as he had every right to be. Instead, he had become stronger, like steel tempered in fire. He had learned to be not only a father, but a mother, a friend, a mentor. And now, as life began to take on new meaning, he decided to give his children something special, a symbol of their new chapter. It all started with a conversation over dinner in early March. Oliver, picking at his roast chicken with his fork, suddenly said, "Dad, can we have a dog? Tom has a Labrador at school, and he's so cool. He even brings the ball." Emma immediately perked up, her eyes lighting up like little stars. "Yes, Dad, a dog. I want a puppy. Can I have a fluffy one, like in the cartoon about 101 Dalmatians?" Michael laughed at their excited faces. The idea of a dog had been in his head for a long time, but he kept putting it off, afraid that he wouldn't be able to handle the extra responsibility. But now that their lives were more stable, he thought that this might be just what they needed, a living creature that would bring joy and help the children feel even more at home. "Okay," he said, raising his hands in surrender, "but only if you both promise to help. Feed her, walk her, clean up after her. This is serious, guys." Oliver and Emma nodded so vigorously that Michael couldn't help but smile. The next day, he took them to an animal shelter in a nearby town. They spent hours wandering between enclosures until they came across a golden retriever named Max, a 6-month-old puppy with soft fur and big brown eyes who immediately licked Emma's face. Oliver, usually reserved, couldn't hide his delight when Max brought him an old toy and dropped it at his feet. "It's him, Dad," Emma exclaimed, hugging the puppy. "He's ours." Michael looked at them and knew he had no choice. Max had become part of the family before they had even signed the papers. At home, the puppy immediately created chaos. He chewed on Michael's old slipper, knocked over his water bowl, and settled down to sleep on the couch as if he had lived there all his life. But the children were delighted, and their laughter as they played with Max in the yard was the best reward for Michael. Inspired by this, he decided to take another step to make their home truly theirs. The children's rooms, Oliver's with his football posters, Emma's with her collection of plush toys, were in dire need of an update. Michael took a week off work and began the renovation. He painted Emma's room a soft lavender she'd chosen, put up new shelves for her books and drawings, and hung a garland of little stars above her bed that glowed in the dark. He updated Oliver's furniture, replacing his old bed with a set of bunk beds so he could invite friends over for sleepovers, and added a chalkboard where Oliver could plan his training sessions. "Dad, it's like a hotel," Emma said when she first saw her room. She was jumping on the bed, her pigtails bouncing, and Max was barking, trying to join in the fun. Oliver was, as always, more reserved, but his eyes sparkled as he looked around his new bed. "Cool, Dad," he said, trying to sound nonchalant, but his smile gave him away. "Can I invite Tom next week?" Michael nodded, feeling warmth spreading in his chest. He couldn't give them their old lives back, but he could give them a new one, and it seemed to be working. In the evenings, when the children were asleep and Max was dozing by the fire, Michael returned to his journal. He had been writing in it for over a year, pouring out his pain, anger, fear, and then hope and the first steps toward healing. As he reread the entries, he realized that they were no longer just personal notes. They were his story, the story of their family, a story of surviving betrayal and finding the strength to move on. One night, sitting in his office, he decided to turn the entries into a book. He called it The Quiet Storm, a title that reflected the turmoil of emotion tearing at him inside, and the silence in which he tried to protect his children from the truth. He began working on the manuscript at night, rewriting his journal entries into a coherent story. This was not a book about revenge or bitterness. It was a story about pain, about forgiveness, about finding light in the darkness. Michael wrote about his mistakes, about not noticing Sarah's withdrawal, about how his love for her became a burden and then a release. He wrote about children, about their innocence, their resilience, their ability to laugh even after everything that had happened. He wrote about himself, about a man who thought he would break, but instead became stronger. Writing the book wasn't easy. Sometimes he'd sit for hours, staring at a blank screen, unsure how to express what he was feeling. But every time he finished a chapter, he felt a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't know if his book would be published, but that didn't matter. It was his way of making sense of the past and moving forward. Sarah, despite the divorce and the trial, remained a part of the children's lives. Michael, although he could not forgive her completely, understood that she was their mother and did not want to deprive Oliver and Emma of her presence. They agreed on a schedule. Sarah picked up the children on weekends, sometimes for the whole day, sometimes for a couple of hours. She came to school concerts, sat in the front row when Emma danced in her pink suit, and applauded louder than anyone when Oliver scored a goal at a match. Michael stayed away, but he noticed her efforts. She tried to be a good mother, despite everything. They decided to get together for Christmas, not for themselves, but for the children. Sarah arrived at the Maplewood house with gifts, a soccer ball for Oliver and an art set for Emma. Michael cooked a turkey that, to his surprise, was juicy instead of dry like last year. They sat at a table covered in fairy lights that Emma strung up with Max underfoot. Sarah was quieter than usual, but she smiled as Oliver talked about his new game and Emma showed off her drawings. "Mom, are you staying overnight?" Emma asked, her voice full of hope. Sarah looked at Michael, her eyes wary. He nodded, just barely, and she smiled at Emma. "Not today, honey," she said softly, "but I'll come tomorrow and we'll bake cookies, okay?" Emma nodded, though her smile was a little sad. Oliver, as always, said nothing, but Michael noticed how he glanced furtively at his mother, as if checking to see if she would disappear again. After dinner, when Sarah had left, Michael sat with the children by the tree, watching an old Christmas movie. Max was at Emma's feet, snoring in his sleep. Michael looked at them, their faces illuminated by the twinkling lights, and felt that, despite everything, they were his family. Not the family they had once been, but a new one, their own. Spring came to Maplewood, bringing with it a bright sun that bathed the streets in light. Michael finished the first draft of Quiet Storm and sent it to several publishers, not holding out much hope, but feeling like he had done something important. He continued working, taking the kids to activities, walking Max, who had become a full-fledged member of the family. Life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. One day in April, Michael stood by the school fence, waiting for Oliver and Emma. The bus pulled up and the children poured out onto the sidewalk, their backpacks bouncing on their backs. Emma spotted him first and took off running, her pigtails flying. "Dad!" she screamed, throwing herself into his arms. "I got an A in drawing. The teacher said I could become an artist." Oliver, walking slightly behind, rolled his eyes, but his smile was warm. "She's been talking about it all day," he said, coming closer. "Dad, you promised pizza today. Remember?" Michael laughed, hugging Emma and clapping Oliver on the shoulder. "I haven't forgotten, Ollie. Pizza and soda, as agreed." Emma looked at him, her eyes shining. "Dad, you're the best," she said, clinging to him. Oliver, usually reserved, nodded. "Yes, you're fine," he said, but his voice was soft, almost gentle. Michael looked at them, at their happy faces, at their trust, and felt a warmth spread through his chest. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't broken. He was stronger for them, for himself, for their new chapter. They walked home, talking and laughing, and Max was waiting for them at the door, wagging his tail. And in that moment, Michael knew that despite everything, they would be okay. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.